Elijah didn't need anyone to say it aloud. He could feel it. Social studies teachers, especially those who taught history and art, seemed to have an invisible bias. They celebrated white students with artistic talent, but never bothered to ask if Elijah had any talents. They eagerly guided white students through discussions of great historical figures, but when Elijah tried to discuss a black figure, they quickly shifted the topic. They encouraged white students to express themselves, but when Elijah tried to do the same, they looked at him as though he were challenging the order they had grown accustomed to. He didn't need anyone to say it. He knew it well. Elijah had never complained, never confronted anyone, not because he didn't realize this, but because he didn't want to cause trouble. He had once heard his mother say, "The more attention you draw, the more reasons they'll find to hate you. Just do your part." And Elijah did just that. He stayed silent. But what bothered him wasn't being ignored. It wasn't the clear favoritism of the teachers. It was the feeling that they were waiting for him to fail, as if they wanted him to make a mistake, as if he had to make a mistake. And if one day he slipped, they wouldn't miss the chance to prove they were right about him all along. Elijah felt that in every glance, every hollow smile, every long silence. But what they didn't know was that he wasn't going to let them have that moment. The expectation of his failure was always present in the eyes of those teachers, but it had never been as clear as it was today. That morning was just like any other. Elijah sat quietly by the window, his hands quickly flipping through the pages of his book, trying to finish the assignment before class began. He liked the feeling of being prepared, knowing that no matter what anyone thought of him, he always stood firm in who he was. But then, just as he was focusing on finishing the last answer in his notebook, the voice of Miss Richards, one of the oldest history teachers in the school, rang out, breaking the familiar rhythm of the morning. "Elijah, why don't you try answering this question?" The atmosphere in the classroom immediately shifted. The murmurs, the rustling of paper, all stopped. Some students turned their heads to look at him, some in surprise, some in curiosity. Not because the question was difficult, but because this had never happened before. Elijah had never been called on to answer, even though he always raised his hand. But today, they were calling on him. Tyler, the only friend in class who showed any interest in him, silently raised an eyebrow, as if to ask, "What the hell is going on?" Elijah took a slow breath, sitting up straight. His eyes quickly scanned the board to confirm the question. General Sherman's March to the Sea. He murmured to himself, a topic he had studied before. He knew the answer like the back of his hand. And so he answered, his voice calm but firm. It was a military campaign led by General William T. Sherman in 1864, with the goal of weakening the Southern Confederacy's economy and morale by destroying their infrastructure and supplies. The classroom remained silent. No one could refute him. The answer was flawless, without a single hesitation or flaw. But instead of nodding in acknowledgement or offering a supportive smile, as they usually did with other students, Miss Richards simply furrowed her brow, as if re-evaluating something. Then, with a cold tone, she said, "HM. Not bad." That was it. No praise. No recognition. Elijah wasn't surprised, but in that moment, he sensed something unusual. It wasn't just the usual bias. It was something more calculated. These teachers weren't just trying to ignore him anymore. They were doing something else. And soon after, it became clearer than ever. Miss Richards flipped through the grade book, then looked up at the class with a smile that Elijah immediately recognized. This was not a supportive smile, but a purposeful one. "Elijah, tomorrow we'll have a special performance. I heard your grandfather was a skilled pianist. Can you play a piece for the class?" Whispers immediately broke out. Tyler nudged him gently, speaking quietly. "They've never cared about you, and now they want you to play the piano?" Elijah didn't respond right away. He just stared straight into Miss Richards' eyes, and instantly, he understood what was happening. This wasn't an invitation. It was a test. A trap. Elijah had never mentioned his talent for playing the piano. The only thing the teachers knew was that his grandfather had been a jazz pianist, and they had assumed that if Elijah could play, he was just a kid who had picked up a little from someone before him. They didn't expect him to play well. They expected him to fail. He could see it in their eyes. There was no excitement, no genuine expectation, just waiting. Waiting for a moment where he would embarrass himself. waiting for proof of the prejudice they had always held in their minds. He can't be better than the other kids we've placed our trust in. From the back of the class, Brandon, one of the rich kids who had mocked Elijah before, sneered, "Oh my God, can you actually play the piano?" A few other students snickered, but Elijah didn't laugh. He didn't need to ask more. He understood their intentions too well. They wanted him to embarrass himself in front of the class. He could refuse, but if he did, they would have a reason to say he was shy, that he had no talent, that they had been right about him. But if he agreed, then he would decide how this game would end. Elijah scanned the classroom. A few eyes were on him, some curious, some waiting, some simply wanting to see the spectacle. He turned back to look at Miss Richards. Her eyes contained a smug satisfaction, as if she had cornered him into a position where he couldn't escape. But she was wrong. Elijah took a deep breath and nodded. "All right." Miss Richards' smile stretched slightly, but it wasn't a smile of joy. It was the smile of someone who thought they had won. "Good. I'm looking forward to it." But she wasn't the only one looking forward to it, because Elijah had made a decision. He wouldn't just play the piano. He would turn this moment into something they would never forget. Elijah's consent was like a knife cutting through the tense atmosphere in the classroom. As soon as he said, "All right," whispers instantly spread, and a few meaningful glances were exchanged between the students sitting near each other. Meanwhile, at the front of the class, Miss Richards and the other teachers kept their calm expressions, but Elijah noticed something flicker in their eyes, a sense of self-satisfaction, a firm belief that they had achieved what they wanted. They thought he had fallen into their trap. Miss Richards gave a slight nod, her voice authoritative as she spoke. "Very well. I'm looking forward to it. Tomorrow, we will enjoy your performance." She emphasized the word enjoy dramatically, as if announcing a comedy show rather than a music performance. Elijah didn't respond, simply staring straight at her. A brief silence passed between them, as if both were waiting to see who would yield first. But Elijah knew that the one in control of this game wasn't them. It was him. When the class ended, Elijah stood up and walked slowly toward the door, feeling the weight of the eyes following his every move. He didn't need to look back. He could already picture the faces of those watching him with a range of emotions. Brandon, the arrogant one, leaning back in his chair with a half-smile, as though he was waiting for the moment when Elijah would embarrass himself. Madison, the usually quiet girl, looking at him with confusion, as if unsure of what he would do next. Tyler, the only one who showed any sympathy for Elijah, quickly followed after him as he stepped out of the classroom. Tyler waited until they had walked far enough from the class before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "Are you sure about this? They don't want you to succeed, Elijah. This isn't an opportunity, it's an attack." Elijah knew that well. He knew those teachers didn't want to acknowledge his talent. They didn't believe that a black boy, someone they had always ignored, could actually possess a skill superior to the other students. And above all, they didn't want to be proven wrong. But Elijah also knew something more important. He didn't play music for their recognition. He played because he wanted to. Elijah stopped and turned to look at Tyler, a faint smile appearing on his face. "Then I'll show them something they never saw coming." When he got home, Elijah didn't sit down at the piano as he usually did. He stood still in the living room, looking at his grandfather's old piano, the one that had witnessed countless hours of his relentless practice over the years. This piano wasn't like the one in the classroom, a forgotten tool that probably hadn't been touched by anyone in ages. But that didn't matter. He didn't need a perfect piano to make music. He only needed himself. He closed his eyes, letting his hands glide over the keys. Familiar melodies slowly worked their way into his mind. In his head, the image of tomorrow's performance appeared clearly. The eyes of the teachers, the anticipation of the class, the skepticism in their every word. And then he realized something. They weren't prepared for what was about to happen. But he was. As Elijah practiced, the teachers behind this trap continued with their plans. In the teacher's lounge, Miss Richards sat with her legs crossed, one hand resting on the table, her voice calm, yet full of implication. "I think tomorrow's lesson is going to be interesting." Mr. Bradley, another teacher, smirked slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Let me guess. He'll hesitate. He'll tremble. And probably forget the melody. A typical performance from a kid who likes attention but has no real talent. Miss Richards just shrugged, saying nothing. But she didn't object, because that's exactly what they expected. She took a sip of her coffee, then spoke casually, as though discussing something obvious. Elijah Rivers is a smart kid, but that doesn't mean he's special. And tomorrow, he'll understand that. In their minds, tomorrow's lesson would be the moment Elijah Rivers would realize there were boundaries he couldn't cross. But they didn't know that they were the ones misjudging the situation. They didn't know that tomorrow wouldn't go as they imagined. They didn't know that Elijah Rivers wasn't afraid. And above all, they didn't know that the boy was about to teach them a lesson they would never forget. Elijah stepped into the house, closing the door behind him, but his mind couldn't escape what had happened in the class today. Everything had happened so quickly, yet it wasn't a surprise. He had known this would happen sooner or later, but he hadn't expected it to come right now, when he wasn't entirely ready. But was he really not ready? He dropped his bag next to the kitchen table, the smell of food spreading through the small but cozy space of the house. His mother was standing by the stove, gently flipping a piece of fish in an old cast-iron skillet, looking just like every other day, as if nothing special had occurred. But Elijah knew, just by glancing at her face, that she could sense something was different about him. "Is something bothering you, Elijah?" Her voice wasn't too high or too low, but it was enough to pull him out of his swirling thoughts. Elijah hesitated, his mind spinning with whether he should speak up or not. But then, he decided there was no point in hiding it anymore. "Not exactly. It's just that tomorrow, I have to perform piano in front of the class." His mother turned around, her eyes showing a flicker of surprise. But there was no joy or excitement like some other parents might express when hearing their child was going to perform in front of the class. She didn't rush to ask him what piece he would play or if he needed help with anything. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, staring at him for a long while before asking, "Perform?" "Yes," he nodded, feeling the lump growing in his throat. "The teacher suggested I play a piece, but I don't think it was a genuine invitation." His mother didn't respond right away, but her gaze suddenly became sharper. She knew far too well how society worked, how there were hidden motives behind actions that seemed harmless. Her son wasn't naive enough to be chosen for his talent out of the kindness of others' hearts. "And what do you think they want?" Elijah looked down at the table, his hand instinctively tapping a soft rhythm on the wooden surface, a habit whenever he was deep in thought. He took a deep breath, then looked up, his voice more determined than before. "They want me to fail." The silence between mother and son stretched on for a long time, but Elijah didn't feel anxious or worried. He knew his mother was thinking, weighing every possible outcome. She set the spatula down, sat across from him, rested her elbows on the table, and intertwined her fingers, as if preparing to say something important. "So, what are you going to do?" Elijah tightened his grip on his hands, and then smiled softly, not because he felt relieved, but because the answer had been clear to him long before she asked. "I'm going to play music." Dinner passed quietly, more so than usual, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who understood each other, of a mother who knew her son had already found his answer, and of a boy who understood that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he would walk it anyway. After helping his mother clean up, Elijah walked into the living room, where the old piano still held the vibrant sounds of his grandfather. He sat down, placed his hands on the keys, but didn't play right away. He stared at his fingers, remembering the days when his grandfather sat beside him, placing his hands over his, guiding him through each note, each pause. His grandfather had once told him, "Music isn't just sound, it's how you tell your story. When they try to silence you, let the music speak." Elijah closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and let his hands begin to move. The first notes sounded gentle but clear, slow but steady. A classic blues melody, like the summer afternoons when his grandfather played while he sat listening, letting the music soak into him. But this time, he wasn't playing for himself. He was preparing for something bigger. Time passed quickly as he lost himself in the music. When he glanced at the clock, it was nearly midnight. Elijah sighed, stood up, gently closed the piano lid, and walked to his bedroom. He wasn't sure if he'd be able to sleep, but he knew tomorrow would be a long day. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about what would happen the next morning. He imagined the eyes that would be fixed on him when he walked up to the old piano in the classroom. He saw the image of Mrs. Richards standing with her arms crossed, her face no longer smiling, but instead showing a cold, calculating gaze. He heard the whispers of the other students, some mocking, some curious, others simply wanting to see him make a fool of himself. They thought he would tremble. They thought he'd be so nervous he wouldn't remember a single note. They thought that when his hands touched the keys, he'd lose his way, make a mistake, prove they were right about him from the very beginning. But they were wrong. He wasn't afraid. He couldn't sleep, but that didn't matter. He didn't need a good night's sleep to make a moment memorable. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just play a piece of music. He would tell a story, and he would do it in a way that no one could stop. The next day, as Elijah stepped through the classroom door, he immediately noticed a shift in the atmosphere. It was no longer the aimless hustle and bustle of an ordinary morning, nor the carefree laughter between student groups before class. Today, everything slowed down. Everything felt intentional. Some students gathered in small clusters, whispering to each other, their eyes quickly scanning over Elijah as he walked to his desk. It wasn't positive attention. It wasn't admiration. It was a curious, eager look, as if they were about to witness a humorous performance rather than a serious music piece. Brandon, who always topped the list of those who loved mocking Elijah, was leaning back in his chair, hands behind his head, gazing down at him with that familiar half-smile. "So, are you really going to play for the whole class today?" His voice echoed, deliberately emphasizing each word, as if it were the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard. Elijah didn't respond. He didn't need to. People like Brandon weren't worth wasting breath on. Madison, the quiet girl who usually stayed out of bullying, sat 2 desks away. Her eyes briefly skimmed Elijah before turning away. There was no sarcasm, no clear support, just curiosity. Elijah pulled out his chair, but before he could place his bag on the desk, the classroom door swung open, and the group of teachers entered. Their smiles wore a strange shade, a mix of anticipation and a hint of malicious pleasure. They didn't say it, but Elijah could feel it. This wasn't a music performance. This was a public trial, where he was placed under the spotlight, where they could define him the way they wanted. Miss Richards, the one leading this game, walked to the teacher's desk, dropped her folder, and spoke in a calm voice, but with an undeniable emphasis. "Now, let's see what Elijah can really do." Laughter bubbled from the back of the class. Someone cleared their throat, trying to suppress their excitement. Elijah took a deep breath and stood up. Each step echoed on the old wooden floor, neither fast nor slow, but deliberate. He didn't lower his head. He didn't let anyone see hesitation. The piano sat in the corner of the room, like a forgotten witness. It was old, its paint chipped, some of the keys showing signs of wear. A thin layer of dust covered its surface, as if no one had touched it in years. An instrument left unappreciated, just like the way they had treated him all this time. Elijah placed his hand on the keys. His fingers slid across them, feeling their rough texture. Instantly, he realized how long it had been since anyone had cared for it. Some notes would be imperfect. Some sounds would not resonate as expected. But that didn't matter. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound of silence fill the room, letting every gaze settle upon him. He knew what they were waiting for, a hesitation, a sign of discomfort, a moment of awkwardness. They wouldn't get it. Elijah took a deep breath, opened his eyes, and then he began to play. At first, it was just gentle, deliberate notes, a slow but purposeful blues melody, carrying the essence of summer afternoons he had spent hours sitting next to his grandfather, listening to the sounds flowing from the piano keys. In the classroom, the giggles faded into silence. No one expected this. No one expected his fingers to glide so smoothly. No one expected the melodies to sound so full. Elijah struck a chord, and the sound spread across the room. He could feel the shift in the air, a subtle but unmistakable change. Everyone was listening, even those who had once mocked him, even the teachers who had been waiting for him to fail. He let his hands flow naturally across the keys, letting the melody fill the room, letting it tell the story he wanted to tell. A story without words. A story of perseverance, of struggle, of a child underestimated but never giving up. A story they would never forget. At first, it was just soft, flowing notes, a classic blues melody that his grandfather used to play, carrying the breath of the American South, where deep sounds echoed from small bars, from street corners, where unknown musicians poured their souls into each key on the piano. The murmur of laughter in the classroom gradually faded. The whispers disappeared, replaced by an unusually heavy silence. Not the silence of a class listening to a lecture, but the silence of people who had just realized their mistake. Elijah didn't look around, but he felt the shift. No more murmurs. No more gazes filled with anticipation of failure. No one was waiting for him to fail anymore, because they had realized it wasn't going to happen. He closed his eyes, letting his hands continue to move. Each note rang out with unmistakable certainty. This wasn't a boy fumbling with a simple tune. This wasn't a child experimenting with an old, forgotten piano. This was a true musician. He shifted into a more difficult section, letting his fingers glide over the keys with artistry, as if he had practiced it 1,000 times, as if this piano wasn't an instrument left abandoned in the corner of the room, but a part of himself. And then the class was silent. No one expected this. No one. There was a strange moment when Elijah emphasized the difficult chords, the complex transitions that even a skilled player would need to focus intently to execute. But he didn't hesitate. He didn't waver. He knew exactly what he was doing. That was what left everyone in the class confused. Those who had been laughing before now sat up straighter. Not a word was spoken. A few students even leaned forward slightly, as if being pulled into the flow of the sounds filling the room. Brandon, who had always been arrogant and dismissive of Elijah, had stopped laughing. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed over his chest, but his eyes no longer held ridicule. Instead, there was something close to recognition. Madison, the quiet girl who rarely showed strong emotions, was staring at Elijah's hands on the keys, her eyes wide with amazement. Tyler, the only one who had ever believed Elijah could play, couldn't hide his shock. He knew Elijah could play, but he didn't think he could play like this. No one could have imagined Elijah Rivers, the kid they always ignored, always underestimated, had such a talent. But the strongest reaction wasn't from the students. It was from the teachers. Mrs. Richards, the one who had started all of this, stood frozen by her desk. Her face no longer held a smile. That smile had vanished with the first few notes, the moment she realized things weren't going as planned. She had expected an Elijah who would tremble, who would be anxious and clumsy on the keys. She had believed this would be the moment he made a mistake, that he would stumble, falter, and prove one thing. He didn't belong in this world. But what was unfolding before her eyes was the complete opposite. Elijah wasn't trembling. He wasn't anxious. He was in control of the entire room. And that left her rattled. Elijah continued to play. He let his music spread, letting each melody shatter the prejudices they had once held in their minds. He didn't need to say a word. He didn't need to argue or defend himself. The music was doing all the talking for him. Each note was a statement. Each chord was an answer. Each crescendo was an undeniable challenge.